You were saying, sorry. Saying something.
Oh, no.
I was saying to Teresa that
but it's he's a specialist. Probably someone who's being tested.
are those right down home? That I was talking to Will Squirt yesterday. I'm getting some of the background information.
Yeah.
And he is so excited that we're being here and telling the story of the global. But he wants to do a history, maybe for the journal.
Yeah, he was talking about that. That'd be a great idea. Yeah. Okay, I'll be back in a second if you sorry.
No, I'm
At all
the University of Denver. But I am one of the Villanova fellows.
I see.
It was a public ground.
At
first kind of developed here.
I was just
6 and a half.
she's everywhere to be retired.
Now it's kind of a restaurant.
It is everywhere. She's everything. Everything. She's a lovely person.
Like these kind of things that
She's always
thinking about the building.
whatever it is.
Church buildings.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, there's
Not a being featured,
right now it's
looking forward. 5 years ago.
yeah, so I just found out Saturday at dinner.
Just after 10 years.
Doing well. She's like
This is just a cable
Oh, okay, I was just wondering. Making sure.
Right there.
ended up getting there because my flight landed at 9:45. Because you put it in my ear. Are you serious? Oh, man, all right.
All that you know. But also there have been many people
This is Holy Street, this is Times, the New York Times.
I mean, she don't like
so anyway.
Great chat.
And the doctor said, bring it up. This, I just got this week. I just came
Less costly. Danish. It's a great.
I'm gonna do
Right to well,
right.
With your website and then also on Facebook.
Right. Well, I don't know if he does that because
Did you sign it? We appreciate you so much.
I'm sure you did. I can't remember.
When he was horrified, I don't know if he saw you. He felt like that was just as good.
Oh, you sent it to Robert. Sure.
Good afternoon. What a pleasure it is for me to bring up our Emerita Professor, Dr. Katie Day, who will take it from here.
It is great to be back. And one of the first things I noticed is that there's been an upgrade to the lectern. So, oh, wow. Well, it is really such an honor to be here today for this event. And I want to explain a little bit more of the context, and you'll see why it is so very special for me to be here and for all of us. This lecture really grows out of the Global Network for Public Theology, and which is an impressive network which you might not be aware of. It's very low profile. On the website, the Global Network for Public Theology says that it's about academic research partnership that promotes theological contributions to public conversations in local contexts with global perspectives. What that means is that it's a network that with a kind of traveling, rotating center that brings scholars together across continents and cultures to reflect theologically on events in the world. Recognizing that when we are confronted with issues like pandemics, war, climate change, immigration, poverty, hunger, violence, the impacts of these dynamics are local, but they're not confined by national borders. They are at once global and local issues, and public theologians like to use the word glocalism to describe this. So in all of these public issues, theologians are needed because God is in the midst of all of these struggles. And our own perspectives and understandings are greatly enhanced by being in dialogue with those across continents. In the early 2000s, and I was here for a long time for you who don't know, LTSP developed public theology as a paradigm of our pedagogy and curriculum. And so we were invited in 2007 to be part of the founding gathering of the Global Network for Public Theology in Princeton at the Center for Theological Inquiry. There were 22 participants at that gathering, I'm sure you remember, from 6 continents. And LTSP was the only charter member from North America. The only other Lutheran seminary was Sao Paulo, Leopoldo in Brazil, represented by Rudolf. So we come full circle on this journey of the Global Network for Public Theology. This was, as I recall, in 2007, a very heady time, as 22 of us who really didn't know each other very well were envisioning a journal and publications and consultations and collaborations, and then we came around the table to sign the charter document. Since then, amazingly, a lot has happened. So the journal was launched in 2007 and is in its 18th volume. Published by Brill in the Netherlands. In 2016, Sebastian Kim and I co-edited this companion to Public Theology with 33 articles from members from 6 continents and many disciplines, reflecting on some of the big issues at that time in public theology. We have also gathered in person every 3 years and have been hosted by partner institutions in Australia, the UK, South Africa, Germany, and Brazil. And in these gatherings, then the host institution takes on the administrative task for the next 3 years of maintaining the, just kind of overseeing all of it. The next convening is going to be at Fuller Seminary in California next September. So start saving your shekels and making plans and maybe even submitting a paper proposal. Now, after that modest beginning, we have 49 member institutions. And between our gatherings, we form bilateral and multilateral partnerships to generate creative new research. We are guided by an executive committee, which is more than ably represented by Dean Smallwood, who is the North American representative at the table. So that gives you a context of what today is about. It is not a kind of random invitation to someone to lecture. Today, in welcoming Professor Rudolf von Sinner, we have an example of the rich relationships and the deepening dialogue among the members of the global network of public theology. Now let me tell you about Professor von Sinner. He is a Swiss naturalized Brazilian. He speaks and understands about 18 languages, as far as I could see on his resume, his CV. He's also a Lutheran pastor, a professor of systematic theology at the Catholic University in Curitiba, Brazil. There he is the head of the graduate program in theology and a member of the graduate program in human rights and public policies, as well as also serving on the faculty of Stellenbosch University in Stellenbosch, South Africa. He was the chair of the Global Network for Public Theology from 2020 to 2023, and in 2022 we had our last convening at Curitiba. He is now the 3rd editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Public Theology. He has a long list of publications, as you can imagine, and he might be too modest, but I'll be happy to show you this impressive list. But among his publications in English are The Churches and Democracy in Brazil Towards a Public Theology Focused on Citizenship, which we'll hear some of today, and Public Theology in the Secular State, a Perspective from the Global South. Currently, he is a presidential visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he's working on a textbook on the doctrine of the Trinity in a series on ecumenical Latin American theology in Portuguese. And in English, he's working on a book on sovereignty and loyalty. He's married to Helena Santos, who is an artist and a gastronome. Very, very good for a theologian. And has a daughter, Thais Alessandra, who is now in university. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rudolf von Sinner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Katie Day, and also Dean Smallwood, and in your names for the whole faculty in welcoming me here. It was a need, I should even say, for me to be here, has been for a long time, because the former dean, Kiran Sebastian, was a good friend of mine. We met in Germany first when he was doing his doctorate, then in India I was doing research and he came back as a professor there, but we never met here. And now we have the opportunity. Unfortunately, he's not here exactly this evening, but we will meet in another moment. But I'm very happy to be in this institution, which for so long a time he led, and which is now being led by Dean Smallwood. So it's great to be here at this moment. You also heard, and I think it's significant, the name of my wife, not only Elena, which of course remembers the beautiful one from Troy, although she's from Brazil, but I mean the name. But she's Santos, and that makes a bit up for me, because sinner, and even reverend sinner, is... it doesn't mean much in German, but in English, of course, it does. And I was ordained in the Reformed New England tradition before becoming a Lutheran in Brazil. And my wife is Catholic, and her surname is Santos, the saints. So our daughter must be, and is, in fact, Lutheran, no? A sinner from the father and a saint from the mother. So that's very good. So it's great to be here, and I want to, before I start, to pay homage to Gustavo Gutierrez, who passed away yesterday, and it's going on in Facebook. Some of you might have seen it, and of course we know how important he has been for liberation theology, not only in Peru, in Latin America, but in the whole world, and has inspired so many people. So we have to let him go at some moment, as we do now, but we are so touched by what he's brought to us, and I'm sure he will continue to inspire us with his work, especially on a theology of liberation, published, I think, for the first time at the end of the 60s. And I have a verse here where he says, "Para mí hacer teología es escribir una carta de amor al Dios de mi fe, a la iglesia a la que pertenezco y a mi pueblo. For me to do theology is to write a love letter, or a letter of love, to the God of my faith, to the church to which I belong, and to my people." So it's a very nice way of saying things, I believe, because that's the love for the whole of his life which he has lived out. So let us remember him and cherish his memory as he passes and precedes us in his passing to the other world. What I want to present to you today are these 5 elements. And I start with the introduction, and there with a quote from a carnival samba which was presented in 2020, so just before the pandemic closed everything. It's the Estação Primeira de Mangueira is the group, and the theme they had, overall theme, was "The truth will make you free." And it says, among others, "I am from Estação Primeira of Nazareth. Black face, indigenous blood, female body. Poor show-off boy in buraco quente. My name is Jesus of the people." Of course, it does rhyme in Portuguese, which it does not in English. But you can see what's in it. The Estação Primeira is, in fact, the name of the samba group also. It refers to a train station, therefore the first station, indeed, where the group was founded. And they will change that from Mangueira, which the place is, to Nazareth, and you will know just in a minute why this is so. So the Brazilian carnival evokes topics that are at the center of society's attention and provokes by means of irony, estrangement, and enthusiasm. The samba school Estação Primeira da Mangueira of Rio de Janeiro was the champion of the so-called special group in 2019, when it highlighted the history of black and indigenous people in Brazil and paid a special homage to Marielle Franco, a city council member and social activist who was murdered in March 2018. In 2020, it put in the firing line positions of then-present Brazilian politics. So we already had the government of Jair Bolsonaro, many of which have religious connotation. The very title of the theme song, "The Truth Will Make You Free," evokes the passage of John 8:32. "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free," which was, ironically or not, often quoted by Brazil's former president Jair Messias Bolsonaro. Obviously, the respective meaning given to that verse refers to quite different views of truth and freedom. Popular opinions such as good criminals are dead criminals, and the trend towards arming the population and liberalizing the use of arms by police officers, as defended by Bolsonaro and many in Brazil, not least Christians, are contrasted by the Samba school with the first station of Nazareth, referring to Jesus, obviously, to a Jesus who is not a Messiah with a weapon in his hand. Now, this verse is a reference to Bolsonaro, both his middle name Messias, which is his name he was really baptized in, and his factually compatible behavior with that, and the frequent position of his fingers that mimic a firearm. So in many photographs you can see him like this. Thus, this is a form of public theology that throws itself in the midst of a central and traditional element of Brazilian culture into the parade so as to challenge everyone's tranquility by putting a mirror in front of society and of the presently strong presence of religion in the political arena. According to Brazilian sociologist, José de Souza Martins, let me just see whether I can bring him up. Yeah. Religions, I quote, "religions occupy an increasingly large space in social reality. It is a search for power as a means to impose upon the whole of society the values of these culturally minoritarian, conservative, and often intolerant groups. A religion of power is emerging here, and the power of religion is being established through it," end of quote. There is also, however, in Carnival a religion, as it were, of Mangueira, whose protagonist is a Jesus opposed to that movement by affirming a faith without power and weapons. "Just love," it says, and I go back to this, you can see the small cross at the foot of the big one. It says, "Só ame," just love. Of course, Samba and Carnival are not a place of a cautious, well-rounded and neutral reflection, but of provocation. It is on the basis of this craftiness that we must reflect in our society, our life, our faith, and in the respective context about public theology. In a similar way, Riobaldo Tatarana, created by renowned Brazilian physician, diplomat, and author João Guimarães Rosa, is very religious, but does not follow any religion in its institutional form, and nonetheless resorts to any religion in order to, as he says, to get rid of craziness, desendoidecer. It's a neologism, it doesn't exist, that word, but it sounds very nice, doesn't it? To get rid of your craziness through religion. And what craziness is that? That is part of his mad life as a gunman in the backwoods of Brazil. He has no certainties, but access to the forces of transcendence. His religiosity derives from his daily clash between the limits of meeting the needs and the possible fairness in the relationships with others and with life, says Lutheran journalist Antônio Carlos Ribeiro. Ribeiro claims that a public theology faces questions and risks to respond to the pains of humankind. And he refers to the US-American Catholic theologian David Tracy, in whose view Christian faith, as trust in and loyalty to God and to Jesus Christ, demands a fundamental trust in and loyalty to the world in all its ambiguity. For a start, this sounds very Lutheran to me, and very Brazilian. A public theology on its practical side is situated in the real world based on a deep love for it, precisely in the midst of its ambiguities. In this sense, it is aligned with the mission of Jesus Christ, who sat, ate, spoke, interacted with people at the margin of society, tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, foreigners, among others. Jesus didn't lack courage to challenge those who exercised power in society. Questioned by the high priest, Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly," and the Greek there says with paresia, to the word. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing secretly. John 18:20. It was Michel Foucault who, in a series of lectures at the Collège de France in 1983-84, expounded the various facets of the parrhesiastes, the one who speaks paresia, referring also to biblical texts. The parrhesiastes is the person who tells with frankness what the truth forces him to tell, even at the risks of their life. The gospel message, in turn, is not restricted to the inner audience, nor only to religious worship, liturgia, but encompasses action in the world through life testimony, martyria, through service to the most needy people, diaconia, through the proclamation of the coming kingdom of God that should guide action, kerygma, through the creation and maintenance of community, koinonia. These 5 aspects have marked the Church's being since the early communities. That is, without each one of them, there would be no Church, without each one or either one of these aspects, dimensions. Thus, there is no Christian Church if it is not concerned with the whole world and not only with its own members. If there is an internal consistency in the perception and understanding of God, theology, there is, by extension, external and thus public pronouncement and action. What changes in the course of history is the specific shape of what the public is, and as a result, theology also adapts, develops, and reinvents itself. Jesus' speech was public, as well as his actions of encouragement and comfort, challenging and healing. His proclamation claimed to be good news, the gospel for the oikumene, the inhabited world as a whole, and all the people inhabiting it. Since Jesus was perceived as a threat to the established power, he was executed in public, as many other visionary persons throughout history. The suffering of people today and the cry of victims are mirrored in the crucified Christ. And Gutierrez was one of those who worked a lot on exactly that issue. This is why the Christ on the cross of the Mangueira Samba school is represented by a young black man living in a peripheral community and riddled with bullets. A public theology, note, I use the indefinite article. With the focus proposed here is a theology that tries to analyze the public space and how it is shaped concretely in a specific context, situating the religious communities, and in this case the Christian churches, in terms of their actions and their pertinence, both from the point of view of the lay state and of theology itself, by reflecting in a critical and self-critical way on the church and its location in this world. In this sense, it presupposes a democratic rule of law that respects religious diversity and freedom, as well as other fundamental rights, in a diverse and plural public space. The issue at stake is how to live out the faith oriented by Jesus' gospel in today's world with its challenges. Whenever possible, this happens by participation of churches, faith-based organizations, and academic theologians in the public sphere. To practice, as did Jesus, both paresia, and I introduce another category which I find extremely important, kenosis, stemming, of course, from Philippians chapter 2, the getting void, to empty oneself from not clinging on to the divine powers. So kenosis I freely translate, both paresia and kenosis I freely translate as boldness and humility, which is, I believe, the order of the day, to maintain both of them. And public theology is helpful, pointing at the simultaneously necessary analysis of the public and the publics, with, from, and for whom theology is engaged, and of drawing on the resources of scripture, theological tradition, and the diversity of approaches that exist today. At the same time, a close reading of the respective context and the presence of religion in it is indispensable, not least in Brazil, and I would assume also in this country, which have similar movements of an even bolder, violent, and anti-democratic vision of Christianity and of politics. In my case, the focus has been and continues to be on a theology of citizenship as public theology, when citizenship is not mainly, you can see here this major study to the right, which was already mentioned by Professor Day, So when I say citizenship, I do not refer in the first place to national citizenship or having a passport of a specific country, which can, of course, be extremely exclusive. But the struggle for the conscience and effectiveness of fundamental rights for all. So even if you are a citizen of a country, you might not actually have access to citizens' rights. Yeah? So it is seeking to be inclusive, not exclusive. As we are celebrating 200 years of Lutheran and indeed Protestant presence in Brazil this year, I shall use this, my church, as a case study of how it has tried in the midst of all its own and the world's ambiguities to struggle for citizenship in a changing public sphere and what kind of theology it resorted to. So after a bit lengthy an introduction, now we have a very short history of Lutherans in Brazil. Lutheran churches are a tiny minority in Latin America. They have emerged primarily through migration, especially in the Cono Sur, the southernmost part of the Americas. The largest Lutheran presence is in Brazil. The Evangelical Church of the Lutheran Confession in Brazil, and I will use the acronym in Portuguese, ISLB. So if ever I say a word which you have no clue what it is about, then I'm speaking about my church, ISLB. So this church is today the second largest nationally constituted historic Protestant church in Brazil after the Seventh-day Adventists, with approximately 630,000 members. There is also, as always where there are Lutherans, there's more than one church, right? So there's also the Brazilian Evangelical Lutheran Church, founded by missionaries from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in 1904, with today about 240,000 members. Furthermore, there are some independent congregations. Protestant immigration into Brazil started in 1824. In that year, the constitution of the now independent Brazilian Empire reaffirmed Catholicism as state religion, but conceded that other religions will be allowed with their domestic worship or particular worship in houses destined towards this aim without any exterior form of a temple, which essentially meant it couldn't have a spire nor bells. Immigrants, among them many Protestants, not only, there were also Catholic immigrants from Germany, for instance, and other countries, but many of them were Protestants, evangelical in the traditional sense, as they called themselves, came mainly from Germany, but also from Switzerland, Austria, Luxembourg, and Russia. They came predominantly from Lutheran territorial churches, but were also united or reformed. So the Swiss were usually reformed and joined then what today is the Lutheran Church in Brazil, as I did. In those countries, poverty and disproportionate population growth prevailed at the time, so that governments were interested in immigration without return, and partly also financed it. Religious interpretations shaped emigration for some. For example, one song compared the migrant families to Abraham and his calling by God to move to a new land. The song ended with the words, and you have it there on the slide, "We trust firmly in God, his holy word, so we now leave for Brazil. Auch wir vertrauen feste auf Gott, sein heilig Wort, so gehen wir von dannen jetzt nach Brasilien fort." And a bit more mundane, but maybe also more authentic, who knows. Wir ziehen in ein anderes Land, da finden wir Gold wie Sand. Wir wandern nach Brasilia, hurra, hurra, nur Schulden lassen wir da. We are moving to another country. There we'll find gold like sand. We'll go to Brasilia, hurrah, hurrah, only debts we leave behind. And in fact, the first pastor of what is today the Lutheran Church, the first pastor of a congregation there had to flee from Germany because he was highly indebted and couldn't pay his debt. For its part, the Brazilian Empire was interested in the entry of white immigrant families. Some replaced African enslaved in the coffee plantations of São Paulo because the slave trade had already become too dangerous and expensive. After the revolutions of the African Americans in Haiti in 1804 and the Malays rebellion in Bahia in 1807-10, the descendants of European immigrants feared a more widespread uprising of the African Brazilian population, which already constituted the majority of Brazil's inhabitants at the time. With the aim then of whitening society, European settlers were invited into the country who were not to live on the usual large estates of coffee and sugarcane plantations, but were to practice subsistence farming as a family on small plots of land, without slaves, and therefore being induced to having many children. Nestor Beck, a Brazilian Lutheran theologian, wrote 10 years ago that despite great efforts over 2 centuries, Luther's theology, and I quote him, has had no notable impact in Latin America, not even in Brazil, end of quote. Now, I believe this evaluation has to be nuanced. In 2003, the movie Luther received considerable attention, even among the Catholic population, and was used in theological faculties, including Catholic faculties. This was even more the case with the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation in 2017. It was celebrated through lectures, church services, some of them ecumenical, commemorations, publications, special stamps, as you can see here, dedication of statues, shows, concerts, and media coverage. The enthusiastic statement of a young Lutheran woman, "Luther is show," which I overheard, points both to Luther's suitability as a media event. He fits much better than the very slim and ascetic Calvin. Maybe Zwingli would do better, but usually Luther is more appealing. But he was in his time also. Luther is the best documented, mediatically best documented person in the Middle Ages. And so Thomas Kaufmann, who has written on that, the historian in Göttingen, speaks about the generation L of printing natives. So it was attractive, Luther, for them at the time, and it's contemporarily he is attractive for digital natives. And admittedly also to the fact that the interest relates more to the person of Luther and the religious, social, linguistic, and educational changes initiated by him than to Lutheran theology or to the Lutheran Church. The 2024 celebrations, which included 2 solemn sessions in the Chamber of Deputies, one on 200 years of the German immigration, you see the stamp on the right, and the other one on 200 years of Lutheran presence, which was just last week, again, a special stamp, focused on the contribution of Lutheranism to the country, namely in education, health, and social assistance. While such recognition is well deserved, one cannot but also state that, especially from the contribution of some politicians who spoke during the solemnity, there was exacerbation of a Protestant work ethic to the extent of suggesting development in Brazil started only with German Protestant immigration. A statement which is, of course, implicitly racist, given that indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, besides Catholics of Portuguese origin, had been there for a long time. Have they contributed nothing? Disdain for indigenous and Africans, in fact, for all Brazilians, as they called them, which were the people who spoke Portuguese, has been part of the German church, as they sometimes thought of themselves and were also called, throughout its history. In a special way, as it became part of a pan-Germanic movement actively promoted from Germany between the creation of the German Reich in 1871 until the end of the Second World War. This is something still not sufficiently dealt with in our church. A remarkable contrast was the council president, Ema Mata Dung Sintra, a layperson, during the Congress solemnity, who greeted the public at the end of her speech, not in German, as the others did, but in a local indigenous language. Let me just show you this also. This was of one of the big show, where Luther was show, and it attracted many people in a huge gymnasium. And here you see Ema Duntra, who actually was the most theological contribution I've heard from a layperson, in that the church president, who was a pastor and so on, she also spoke and so on, but I think this was the strongest testimony during the whole act, which lasted more than an hour. And she says, there must be against fundamentalisms and the abuse of the gospel, as she called it. There must be a responsible interpretation of the gospel and the ESLIB's position, which points to peace, reconciliation, to dialogue, always in the perspective of justice and democracy. And this is our greatest wish as Lutherans. We would like to participate in the development of our country. That is a wise and also theologically sound position, pronounced much more clearly, as I said, by a lay leader, more clearly than by the ordained ministers that spoke. Let us now look at the three struggles for citizenship of the Lutheran Church in Brazil, as I'm suggesting. Now we come to the third part. The ban on erecting bell towers was not much of a problem at first, because the congregations met mainly in the communitarian schools, founded by the immigrants, whose teachers also performed pastoral tasks. This grassroots congregational model, which implemented the priesthood of all believers in its fullness, not only in religious but also in social terms, was soon transformed into a more clerical model by the arrival of pastors trained in Germany and sent out by missionary societies. The previous lay preachers were now stigmatized as pseudo-pastors or brandy pastors, Schnapspfarrer, because some would take brandy as payment for their services. In terms of civil rights, it was problematic that there were no public cemeteries and no civil registry office for registering birth and marriages, as these official acts were in the sole hands of the state church. This forced the Protestants to set up their own cemeteries. Since they were neither legally baptized, because there was only Catholic baptism, nor legally married, because for that you need to be in the baptism register of the Catholic Church, they were second-class citizens, if they were even citizens at all. Thus, the 19th century, until the full guarantee of religious freedom following the founding of the Republic in 1889, can be considered a time for struggle for the civil rights of immigrant families, which I call the first struggle for citizenship, focused on the recognition of Lutherans as citizens of their new country. Now, with the expanding pan-Germanic tendencies of the now constituted German Empire, the congregations and synods became increasingly connected to the central church bodies in Germany. From this point on, a clearly evident Germanity emerged. I'm not sure if there's any connection to Germantown Avenue here, or I learned that there's a patriarch of Lutheran. I didn't know this title existed in the Lutheran Church, but apparently there is an important. So it might not totally be unknown to you, the issue of being German and of German origin. In any case, not a few at the time advocated that the Volkstum, ethnicity, and church, Germanness and gospel belong closely and indissolubly together. In the two world wars, however, the Brazilian government severely restricted contacts with Germany and even the public use of the German language in Brazil. So that the Lutheran churches were increasingly left. Let me just see, this should have been on a slide. Yeah. No, that slide has dropped out. Sorry about that. I had a slide with some pictures referring to that. So now the Lutherans were more and more left on their own and had to found even their own seminary to train pastors. And thus in 1946, and you see today's building to the right, the Escola de Theologia in São Leopoldo, now Faculdade Est, where I was for 16 years a professor, came into being. And this phase heralded the second phase of the struggle for citizenship, the clear affirmation of the church as a Brazilian church. The Second World War had cut the umbilical cord to Germany, and the soon-to-be-named ISLB had to orient itself completely towards Brazil. So it was not only of its own making, it was external pressure. But the first General Council of the Synodal Union, which united the existing four synods, only one of which was explicitly Lutheran, the others were united, took place in São Leopoldo in 1950 and emphasized, and you have the quote there, "The Synodal Union is the Church of Jesus Christ in Brazil, with all the consequences that flow from this for the proclamation of the gospel in this country and the co-responsibility for shaping the political, cultural, and economic life of its people." End of quote. At the same time as this affirmation of a decidedly Brazilian identity and citizenship, as well as the Lutheran confession, the nascent ISLB joined the World Council of Churches and a bit later, interestingly, the Lutheran World Federation. So the church from the outset affirms itself both as Lutheran and as ecumenical in the Brazilian context. When a military regime took power on 1st April 1964 in a coup called revolution, this was clearly welcomed by almost all of the churches because the widespread anti-communism had great misgivings about possible left-wing movements. And may I say, the CIA was also quite active at the time in supporting some of these military government that came up. Lutherans were mainly politically conservative or abstinent. The Lutheran middle class profited from the Brazilian economic miracle in these years. In the highly patriotic climate, the church also did not want to be tagged by criticism as being foreign. However, the relocation of the Fifth Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation, which was planned to be in Porto Alegre in 1970 and was then relocated at short notice to Evian on Lake Geneva, had a catalytic effect, which led to a new attitude. There already had been rumblings in the ESLB, especially among the pastors, for whose critical attitude the theological school was largely responsible, so that it even came into the police's radar. And you have the second quote there, which is actually done by Ernesto Geisel, a high-ranking military who would later become the second last military president, and he was of Lutheran baptism. Not necessarily of practice, but of Lutheran origin. And he says, or wrote, in a seminary in Rio Grande do Sul in São Leopoldo, where there was a strong leftist infiltration promoted by German pastors. Like many Catholic priests, they too cannibalized, he uses that word, cannibalized the problem of land reform, land distribution, and poor settlers, end of quote. Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison were the reading of the time for those who defended exactly that position, as was Richard Schall's profound transformations in the light of an evangelical theology. The same can be said about Jürgen Moltmann's theology of hope, with which Brazilian Rubem Alves, in his Princeton doctoral thesis, a dissertation, debated critically. And in fact, even paying homage to Gustavo Gutierrez, we have to say Alves was a bit earlier than him to speak about Towards a Theology of Liberation. Just his dissertation was not published under this title. The publisher thought nobody will read this, so he published it under Towards a Theology of Human Hope. But it was to be, and I've seen the dissertation in the library in Princeton. It's Towards a Theology of Liberation. The 1962 Northeast Conference, sponsored by the World Council of Churches on Christ and the Revolutionary Process in Brazil, so before the coup, radicalized many Protestant theologians, including Lutherans. The spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the vigorous revolutionary mobilization of many Catholics did their part. In the ESLIB's General Council at Curitiba in 1970, the Curitiba Manifesto was adopted. From then on, the Church took a more frequent and increasingly critical stance on issues of democracy and civil rights, land reform, economic and social issues, human rights, violence, and ecology. With this began what I call the third phase of the struggle of citizenship. So if one was for their own citizenship, and the second to affirm themselves to be a Brazilian church, now the third one is beyond the church, going out to fighting for the rights of everyone, to seek transformation. The cooperation had intensified with sectors of the Roman Catholic Church, namely the Rural Pastoral Commission, as well as other critical and progressive circles of Protestant churches, especially Methodists, Anglicans, and dissident Presbyterians. The issues and positions were practically the same. Nevertheless, a distinct theological rationale can be discerned in the Lutheran position. From his pastoral experiences with landless peoples, the Brazilian Lutheran theologian at Chicago, Vitor Westele, whom I hope you know, or have known, of course, he's no longer among us, developed both a strong theology of the cross and a spatial or latitudinal, as he called it, eschatology. And that was from his experiences with the landless. His creative reading of Luther inspired many. In his 1991 inaugural lecture at the Lutheran School of Theology in São Leopoldo, he spoke about the seditious charm of theology in the ESLIB. The problem, according to him, was that the institutional church occupied theology and never mediated it with the faith of the people. He said, I quote, "Theology on every side of the theological spectrum continued to sustain the identity of the churches by the guarantee that linguistic unity furnished them, but without any organic connection with the myths and popular imagination of the churches," end of quote. And when he speaks churches, he means congregations. Some of this has certainly changed, but the challenge to find new theological language connected to the life of the people remains even more so, as this life has changed very considerably in these last 30 years. A master of the word, Vitor was in a rare way able to join people's experience through myths, poetry, and political sensitivity with an incredible knowledge and creative reading of Luther and many other authors, from the Greek pre-Socratics to Toni Morrison, from the pre-colonial to the decolonial, and from daily life to abstract thinking. I don't know many other people who are able to do that. The Curitiba Manifesto argued along lines, the 1970 manifesto, along lines that can also be found in later documents, and I quickly summarize them. First, while salvation and history, or the world, should not be mixed or confused, and while priority is always due to God, the witness of faith is addressed to the world. Speaking to the world is therefore part of the mission of the Church. Second, the Church's proclamation is directed to the well-being of all humanity, and therefore includes social, economic, political, cultural, and physical aspects. In order to contribute to this well-being, the root causes must be recognized and eradicated. That's the word I use there. Third, the Church cooperates with other parts of civil society and also with the state in its effort to build certain relationships through ethical principles stemming from its proclamation. Fourth, a kind of two regiments doctrine is found at the basis of the argument that while church and state are to be distinguished, they cannot be considered separate and independent from each other. Both spheres, says the Church, are under the power of Christ, which secular rulers may not claim for themselves. Believers are Christ's disciples and citizens of their country. Fifth, the Church therefore has a critical role to play as guardian and conscience of the nation in a co-responsible partnership, so that solutions can be found for society. Now, while in its content this text is, for our eyes today, not particularly revolutionary, that was still a remarkably bold statement given a very small church in that country and its timid political action up to that moment. And it should be noted that according to British sociologist Paul Freston, I think today he teaches in the US, who is an expert on Protestantism and Pentecostalism in Brazil and beyond, the Curitiba Manifesto, he says, was the only public statement by a Protestant church that criticized the military regime. Now, I'm passing a bit quickly over what's next, but in my book, I argued, or I suspected that the people in the congregations were always much more conservative than the leadership and the pastors and the theological training institution. But I had no material to prove that, because the church journal, the Jornal Evangelico, was ever more an organ of the church leadership, so it didn't represent the whole of the church. But in the meantime, one can say that with the emergence of Jair Bolsonaro, people who had probably held back for a long time because of respect and recognition of their pastors now started to speak up. So I believe that tendency has always been there, but now it came up because there's now a man in the presidency who speaks whatever he wants to speak. Does it make sense or does it not make sense? But then people also in the congregations felt authorized now to speak up and against their pastors, and very strongly so. Some were even dismissed, some pastors, because they were political, which means left-hand political. Yeah. Being on the right is not considered political. So I come to my fourth point and second last, Lutheran theology in the Brazilian public sphere. If we look at what I have tried to show until now, many Lutheran theological assets, like the universal priesthood of all the baptized, the work of all within their vocation towards the common good, the task of the Church to extend its hand to the needy and work towards justice, all of them appear. The Church had to find a way of moving from being alien to the context and bound to Germanity to become fully Brazilian and detached from Germany, which does of course not mean that history would be forgotten or all ties severed. But matter-of-factly, while still very present in the older generation, for the young ones, Germany as a reality, a myth or a concept fades away rapidly. Being Lutheran in Brazil is ever less about being expatriate German. And being German today is also very different, of course, from what it meant 100 years ago. Germans German pastors, for instance, when they come to work, we still have some on exchange program, and they come to work in a Brazilian congregation, they hear the kind of German that is spoken there, and they don't have a clue what people are talking about. And then people say, ja, spricht er kein Deutsch? Can the person not speak German, the pastor, Because we are speaking German and the pastor doesn't understand. So it's, of course, a German has developed in its own right and its own way. In any case, it was, as it is, necessary to sustain that being Brazilian is to be co-responsible for the country and especially for the citizenship of those to whom it is particularly denied. As this position developed during a military regime, it is not surprising that theological reasoning focused on the relationship to the state, to democracy and social justice. The situation was dialectical, positioning the good against the bad, the lordship of Christ against the lordship of the state. Even if it was meant only to be valid for Christians or Lutheran Christians and to foster their responsibility, to argue that Christ is Lord over all, as was affirmed in church documents and president speeches, has become today somewhat odd and ambiguous. It had its right of being at the time a kind of Barthian reading of Luther, so bringing sovereignty into the two kings of doctrine. Today, in the midst of ever-growing religious diversity, evangelico-political musculature, and the affirmation of God's sovereignty in combination with a right-wing government, certainly not with a left-wing, such affirmation is, to say the least, ambiguous. So the interesting thing is that God's sovereignty, if before it was on the protesters' side against the military government, now it's moving to the government side. Saying God's sovereignty means that Bolsonaro has to be the leader of this country. The call to freedom is certainly, which came up over and again, is certainly continuously appropriate, as is Luther's idea that it is a freedom to serve. And it happens, as for Luther, in the ambiguous mix of good and evil, faith and non-faith, inner and outer, present and future. This has to be reclaimed in a time when some people seem to know far too much about God's will and the authority of God's human followers. It seems to me to be healthy and necessary to well remember, on the one hand, the inspiration both of the Barmen Declaration, which celebrates 90 years this year, when Reformed theology was more apt to counter the state's onslaught than Lutheran. Other declarations have followed in a similar line, like Belhar in South Africa in 1988, and in the Orthodox world in Ukraine in March 2022, a declaration against the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which exactly follows the logic of Barmen. And all of them were accusing the church of being heretic, in being too close to the state. They don't even mention the political situation as such. Of course, it becomes somehow evident, but they don't. They are directed towards the church. Of its own kind is the Accra Declaration of 2004 of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, directed against global capital and economic and environmental injustices. Sometimes boldness is the need of the day, but also a kind of a doctrine of the two regiments, and note I use regiments here, not kingdoms, for a good reason, that calls for the strengthening of the secular government over against its subservience to a priestly, and I mean priestly here in a very broad sense, regime, which is important and necessary, calling the church to humility. God is present in this world, yes, but hidden. And now we come metaphorically back to the world of carnival. It's hidden behind the masks, the larvae dei of economia, politia, and ecclesia. As Vitor Westele highlights, the masks both disguise and allegorically reveal the true situation, which is even more masked than the masks. Differently from other contexts in that time, as Hans-Jürgen Prien noted in 1977, an explicit two kingdoms or two regiments doctrine was hardly present in the ISLIB, but it was often implicitly present, first in an uncritical attitude towards the German or the Brazilian state. In contrast, criticism came precisely from followers of Karl Barth and the Barmer Theological Declaration, as well as from reading Bonhoeffer. Interpreting the two kingdoms, or regiments rather, doctrine through Barth's theology and drawing directly on Luther's writings, Brazilian theologian and church leader Walter Altmann stated that, I quote, "the so-called two kingdoms are distinguished in task and means, but they overlap in space. They are linked at their base and in their purpose. God is the Lord of both, the human being the purpose of both. Thus, state and church remained instrumental to what is greater to them, limiting them and linking them reciprocally." End of quote. Even more radically, Vitor Westele affirmed that the two kingdoms doctrine is in fact no doctrine at all, but, as he calls it, an epistemic principle that teaches the faithful that to know Christ is to know justice. And so he quotes Luther saying, that's from a sermon on Matthew 22, where he says, "Thus the world is full of God. In every alley at your door you find Christ. Stare not at heavens." It is noteworthy that the ISLB defines its attitude from the inside out. It contributes to peace in society and stands in solidarity with all who suffer injustice, precisely because it adheres to the primary commandment, which is to bear witness to the work of God and to learn to believe, hope, and love. That is from a letter from the then church president. In this sense, the church's action in the public sphere is part of its mission, as already the Curitiba Manifesto from 1970 had emphasized, and the mission plan of 2000 reinforced. Now, the very recently, last week at the General Council, accepted missionary goals 2025-30 focus on two main goals, and I find that very significant. The first one is to strengthen the community's vitality and the church's integral growth. Integral growth. Second, to strengthen the impact of the church's public witness. These are the two goals of the whole missionary plan. That means the church looks inward and outward at the same time, and does this through the four dimensions of mission in the stricter sense of witness, and then again inwardly and outwardly, formation of all in the church as a continuous path, diaconia seeking to promote justice, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue, and governance, management, and communication. These are the four fields. This stands quite uniquely, I must say, in today's Brazilian religious landscape, with the church leadership not just speaking up to power, but also inserting itself into the wider ecumenical movement and a partnership with all people of goodwill, as they once formulated, echoing, of course, what the Catholic Pope's German terminology in general is, to direct to all people of goodwill. Now I come to the conclusion, or concluding rather. Being Lutheran in Brazil in the midst of religious pluralism and political polarization. As we have seen, the ISLB has gone through several struggles for citizenship. First, for its members to be recognized by the Brazilian state and society. Second, for its Brazilian identity and active participation in the public sphere. And third, for the well-being of the entire population and of nature. It has become an active church in the public sphere through education and diaconia, as well as internal training projects and public demonstrations. It interacts and collaborates in many places in a non-proselytizing and non-partisan way with the public authorities, which is why it's quite widely recognized in being a partner which does not proselytize or pray wherever it's not necessarily adequate, but they actually do good work. It is a church that is both confessional and ecumenical, firmly participating in eminent ecumenical organizations in the country and internationally. It has a widely recognized theological and academic seriousness. The ISLB's participatory structure, with power shared at all levels between ordained ministers and lay leaders, is democratic and formative in this sense for citizenship. Especially in recent years, however, the other side of the coin has become evident, as I already indicated, when members and presbyters, which are the lay leaders elected to lead the parish, seek to exercise ideological and political control over ministers. It's natural, probably, that after a long time of obedience and respect for them, held back dissatisfaction, presumably existing for a long time, will surface, and there will be conflicts. That's part of democracy. At the same time, it raises, however, the question of the understanding of the gospel and the Lutheran confession, which should function like the fundamental rights in the 1988 Federal Constitution, which are not subject to change, although they are, of course, subject to interpretation and concrete application. The gospel, as read by Luther and the Lutheran tradition, should also constrain the ISLIB in relation to politics and wider action in society. The historical ethnic identity of the ISLIB and its precursors as a German church was what gave it cohesion for a long time, constituting it as a kind of a national Volkskirche in the Schleiermacherian sense. So it's not a confessional church, it's not a state church, but it's your member because of tradition, because your forebears are. Now that no longer works, as I've been saying, but it held the church together and meant it was able to develop a certain consistency. Now, this cohesion is breaking down for reasons of social mobility, effective insertion in Brazil, religious mobility, among others. At other times, there have been attempts to replace ethnic cohesion with confessional cohesion, and understand that this attempt was largely frustrated. But there is a chance for confessionality to prevail without prejudice to ecumenical engagement amid the increasingly plural religious field in Brazil, including in relation to the political choices made within. So what some think, let's go with those who have success, those who grow. That's our way. But then, if we do that, we will just become one among all the others, and we lose completely what is strong in our church. So being ecumenical and open to pluralism also means reaffirming, of course, in a new context, reaffirming our identity. Interestingly, there are few people who leave for reasons of disagreement with the theological line in community. There are some now, but during the Bolsonaro time, some left because of that, but normally that's not the case. The main reason for joining the church through profession of faith is the preaching and teachings. And there has been a group of Pentecostal people in the north of Brazil who was dissatisfied with the moralistic rigor in their church, and they looked for an ecumenically open church where you could drink alcohol and dance. And so they looked in the internet and they found us. I'm not sure drinking was so closely there, but it's actually true. There is quite a bit of Oktoberfest and beer drinking and so on. And of course the second altar is the grill, the barbecue. But beyond that they came, and we've done empirical research among some of those also, and it was clear they came also because of the consistent evangelical, in the sense of gospel-bound preaching, which they did not find in their churches there had been. In addition to the growing religious pluralism in Brazil, which in absolute numbers is still the most Catholic country on earth, but at the same time also the most Pentecostal, there is also considerable diversity within the ISLIB. Various movements are courting church members, theology students, the attention of church leadership and the public, some pietistic, others evangelical in the Anglo-Saxon sense, others follow a progressive, socially and politically committed line. And more recently, new movements have come up, some highly conservative and supposedly truly Lutheran, like the Gnesio Lutherans, right? Others with very shallow theological foundation make it their main task to expose so-called leftist pastors and try to alert congregations they should never call these pastors to their service. And tragically, sometimes it works. In 2018, the first woman was elected. By the way, I showed you before on this, the first woman ordained. Ordained also, but years before she was ordained, she was working as a pastor. So we had women in the pastoral work from the end of the 1970s, 76, 77, but she was actually only ordained in 82. Yeah, but she already did everything a pastor would do. That was quite common, even among men, that they would be ordained a couple of years later than actually doing the work. And so because all the others I quote here are men, I'm sorry for that. That's the reality, unfortunately, with the voices we have around there. But I made sure at least one woman would apply. Now there's the second one, which is our church president, Sylvia Gens. Once again, mission is one of the central issues, with a focus on animating communities. The pastoral letters of this period, differently from others in earlier with Altmann and Brakemeyer, these church presidents were more theologically substantial, These demonstrate a pastoral approach and a focus on communities with frequent biblical references but little theological reflection. One of the first manifestations, however, was a manifesto commissioned by the council that elected the new presidency in 2018, so exactly when Bolsonaro was also elected as president, and this was becoming clear. And the manifesto has the title, "Our Commitment is the Gospel." Its text reflects the polarized situation at the time of Bolsonaro's election to the presidency and states for the following. The SLIB defends freedom of expression, but it must not be confused with lying, slander, hatred, discrimination, and apology for violence. Polarizations manifest themselves on the political scene and generate tensions in social relations. We repudiate and condemn hate speech, violence, racism, and homophobia. Fake profiles and bots are often the source of messages that fuel discord, intolerance, and violence. Falsehoods are repeated so many times that they are taken for truth. The term fake news, created by Donald Trump, the expression, but of course it goes much beyond what he said, has softened the terrible consequences of lying. We must not forget that the devil is the father of lies, and that the Christian commitment is to truth and justice. The 8th commandment commands us not to speak lies. To fulfill it, according to Martin Luther, it is necessary to tell the truth and contradict lies where necessary. Now, this position has, I would say, not yet lost its relevance and is part of a public theology in Brazil in a Lutheran perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was rich and so provocative. And what I want to do is just offer a few reflections very briefly, and then give Professor von Sinner an opportunity to respond, and then open it up for questions. We have time, right? Okay. This is a great example of what public theology is. Professor von Sinner begins by drawing us in, referencing samba, carnival, a sociologist, a fiction writer, a journalist, before he ever gets to a theologian, David Tracy, because all of those are sources before academic theology. And what this reflects is what we say within public theology, that it needs to be multilingual. We need to be able to engage in interdisciplinary dialogue, which means having our dialogical speech understandable, and to be able to understand our dialogue partners. It's also about speech, which is both parisha and kenotic, about boldness and humility. And I think part of that humility is what we saw today. That is that the project of public theology has to be self-critical about the church. We have to critique our positionality as a way, I don't mean this in a transactional sense, but we have no credibility with dialogue partners if we cannot be self-critical. And I think that's what, for example, Martin Luther King, what raised his credibility so much beyond the church was that he could be self-critical and push the church at the very same time that he was pushing society and the state. In telling this story of Lutheranism in Brazil, Professor von Sinner is reflecting how neither church nor society are static, but they are interactive, that they are shaping each other and being shaped by the other. I'm always struck in Lull Lounge, I hope these are still here, these class pictures from bygone days. And these are students who have been through World War I, World War II, many social movements, civil rights, feminism, the ordination of women, and so many things. And you can see in the images how they have been shaped. So we cannot speak of the church and the state or the church and society. It is a dialectical process of reciprocity. And in developing a sense of citizenship, especially for the church in relation to society and to the state. And in so doing, and I think we could see it so well in this story of Brazil, maybe more clearly in another context than our own, that this interaction, this reciprocity, has been a process, a social process, about clarifying roles that define democracy and define the public good. I love the statement that you bring in by Altman, that church and state are distinct but cannot be separated. Again, they're interactive, the co-responsibility that we have for the common good. After all, both originate in God's sovereignty, and we'll read that book, and in Christ, and both have the common goal of human well-being. But there's always engagement with each other. The church is not over against society, not over against the state, nor should it strive to be. But as the Curatuba manifesto says, is the conscience of the state. I'm reminded of Bonhoeffer's essay in 1934 on the Jews, and he likened the state to a cart in that. And he said, when the cart starts rolling over its citizens and crushing them, the church is called to respond. First, to attend to the victims, then to appeal to the state to stop its destructive policies and actions. And if that does not work, then to put a spoke in the wheel. That is to take direct action. And I think it's interesting in reflecting on Brazil and in our own context, maybe, and the years of Nazism, that authoritarian, anti-democratic governance can help crystallize, clarify what the role of the church is. So part of the role of public theologians, and it sounds like the entire Brazilian Lutheran Church is taking this on as an identity, is to notice the cart, to see the cart coming, to see what shape it is taking, not just in terms of the state, but in dominant institutions in society. Then to have public speech, to hold accountable those for violations of human rights, and then to act, because finally public theology is performative. And it is, we think of how in South Africa, another context in which the ecclesiology got crystallized in the context of apartheid. And at first there was the theological critique, and then the theological critique gave rise to widespread organizing by church and outside of the church, and all the way through boycotts and divestments, organizing internationally through to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It reminds me of the widow and the unjust judge. The judge is obviously emblematic of corruption, and this marginal person who knows that she has been wronged continues to persist to the point of being annoying in the face of this corruption. So I think that this moment and this calls us to not to give up like that widow. Finally, I'm struck by the similarities of Brazil and the U.S. The church navigating an uncertain future with disaffiliation, increasing diversity, but also with the threat of fascism and authoritarian leaders who would force to limit rights and the very structures of democracy. And of course, Bolsonaro and Trump were kind of feeding off each other during their years of overlap. So I'd like to end with just, those are some reflections, but two questions for you, Professor. In what ways, you've been here for a while now, and you've been in dialogue with U.S. Theologians and other people in this context. In what ways has the U.S. context at this moment given you some insight into your own context, primary context in Brazil? And secondly, what would you hope that the Protestant church in the U.S. would learn or hear from the Brazilian Lutheran Church? So I will invite you to respond if you'd like, or we can go to other questions first. Do you want? Okay.
Thank you so much. Of course, this second question especially you should discuss together. I mean, you've heard what I tried to say, and I hope it's been meaningful for you. In fact, I was thinking a number of times that some similarities of the contexts are not really coincidental. One is, of course, a migrant church somehow, that inserts itself in another country. Histories, they are different. I mean, you have a strongly Catholic country in South America, which was not the case here. It was had the wall of separation right from the beginning and so on. So that context is a bit different. But of course, the two contexts are and I've seen that as I was here, your first question, they have a lot of similarities going on, both with Trump and Bolsonaro as such, but also with the whole movements that are behind capitals. Was it capitals, not services, capital ministries, I think it's called, or so, which is an organization that works directly with Congress members in order to convince them of a specific idea about religion and politics. And that also has done some work in Brazil. Of course, we have a much more diverse and, in that sense, also nullifying itself Congress, which can be an advantage sometimes. So Bolsonaro just didn't get many things through the Congress because there were over 20 parties. You have a strong president in a similar way as here, but then you have a Congress which was totally different. So the president has to negotiate all the time. And I think this is what secured our democracy for these years. But of course, it also makes it different for now President Lula to govern. I mean, it works both ways, but it has a certain delaying aspect. And here you have, of course, two strong parties. But even then, I understand that the Republican Party, for instance, was much more diverse in earlier years than it is now. And I must say, both in Brazil, where Bolsonaro cannot stand for election again because he's forbidden by a court ruling to do that for the next 8 years. But that doesn't mean the problem is solved. Somebody else will come up, and the polarization still continues. Here, somewhat, if I may say, surprisingly for somebody looking from outside, nothing can avoid that Donald Trump is candidate and can be elected president again. So even though there are many cases against him before court and so on, this doesn't prevent him from being elected, even from being the president. And then forgiving himself, of course, pardoning himself once he becomes the president. So, but these are the specificities of each country's politics and history and laws. But I do see, and that worries me, I do see a strong religious and Christian, with strong Christian overtones, movement supporting, be it either Bolsonaro and his direction or Trump, even though both of them have a huge record, even not legally, all of them legally justified. Well, you cannot go to court for all of them, but for instance, the horrible record in COVID. No? Brazil is second to the US in terms of numbers of deaths. I mean, as far as we know about official numbers, and we don't know whether China gives the correct numbers or some of the other countries, but at least in the Johns Hopkins University statistics, it was US first, then Brazil in deaths, not in cases. Now, why is that? Because of the president's politics. That's very clear. And many of people could have been saved, would have been a different politics. Still, so many people say this is the president God has sent for us. Now, it's always been in democracy you have an option. You can opt this way or that way. But I've never seen such, or at least not in recent times, such a clear alignment which has been strategically forged through WhatsApp, through other social media, through mobilization, and through underground movements that are very present, like I've just learned about the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, in Matthew Taylor's book, for instance, on the violent, it's something about the violent in the title, I forgot now. But in any case, he describes this movement, which was behind the January 6th rioting in the capital. And 2 years later, as was to be expected, we had even a worse rioting, I would say, in Brazil, destroying the three powers around there. And ministers filming themselves as they were there for God and singing Protestant hymns. Then when they found out that they were providing proof against themselves, they tried to extinguish it, but it was too late. Other people had already sent it to the federal police, and many of them are in prison now, which I think is good, because it shows you can do many things. You can have different opinions, different positions. That's natural in democracy, but you cannot, and especially the supreme leader of the government cannot be against democracy as such. And for us as churches and Christians, it is important we guarantee religious freedom both for ourselves and, for that very reason, for the others also. And that's what not always works. People want it for themselves, for their own interest, but not for the others. And so I see it quite dramatic, the situation, I must say. And also interesting that what used to be left-wing argumentation, civil disobedience, going against the state's violence, in the line of Agamben's critique of Carl Schmitt, then against the state of exception, and so on. That's a left-wing critique. And they went to the streets, and they would do civil disobedience, and they would criticize the state. Now we have that on the right side. So the left, all of a sudden, is in a situation to have to support the state in all that kind of democracy. Why not? Not that it's a bad thing, but even the justification has moved to the other place, and they invoke Acts 5:29. You have to obey more to God than to the people, because God wants us to to, if necessary, do away with this government if the government would go back on permissivity in terms of abortion. The issues are so-called gender ideology, LGBTQIA IA plus population demands, and so on and so on. Now, this you find all over the world. You find it in Russia, actually also in Ukraine. The idea this is Western religious stuff and it should be done away with. But that it becomes so powerful against democracy and no longer works as it had always been with, after all, it's Romans 13 in the first place. So the state, is installed by God, which is also problematic. But somehow this was the general line. It's no longer. So now they even speak about civil war, which might come up. They speak about violence. They speak about, in Brazil, they spoke about ousting the Supreme Court altogether. Just think of it. Now, they haven't been able to do that so far, but they tried. And thankfully, the military had no intention whatsoever to do another coup, so they stayed in the barracks. But had that not happened, So I think we are in a very critical situation, Professor Day, to answer to your question, and maybe to both to a certain extent. And I think my hope would be, both here and there, for a church that does not abandon its basis because it might not have so much success as others. Because these successes, they are there, yes, but they're short-lived. They die usually with the leader, or with some exceptions, but usually it's a short turmoil, then people just disperse. And it would give away what is most dear to us, and that's not even the Confessio Augustana or Luther's Catechism or whatever we have also in our confessional baggage. It's the gospel. And my main critique I have towards new churches is not that people dance in the church, that looks like a disco all in black, and they have a stage there, and there's the musicians. They actually do good music. And people dance. No problem with that. My problem is that the sermon has nothing of the gospel. It doesn't even quote the gospel. So I think, and it's therefore not a coincidence that people look for our church, not in big numbers, but they do look for our church and are satisfied there because we have good sermons, we have well-prepared sermons. And I think this is a richness, and also a bit being more laid back in terms of politics and say, well, in the first place, we have to guarantee there is democracy because it's good for all of us. And it's the system that most closely comes today, at least, to enacting a welfare state, to enacting a good living together of different tendencies. And this is what we have to stand for now, I think, and to say, and this our church, at least the leadership says, I'm not saying the congregations necessarily, but the leadership says, this is not us. And the president of the council, that lay person, that lay woman in the Congress, actually the third woman I was showing, yeah? So there are three, not only one or two, three. She would say that very clearly, this is not us, we are different. She said that in Congress. And the session, ironically or not, was suggested and assembled by right-wing politicians. There were some left-wings also, but it's mainly right-wing politicians. And they would speak about how important the Germans were for the development of the country because they would bring the work ethic and so on, as I quote. But she undid them all. And this is what I have a hope for my church and hopefully also for yours, that we do not give up on that, because that's our reason for being. But what is the use of a huge church which doesn't know what it believes, what it stands for, and nobody else knows. And I also do hope it will not stand for a specific president, whoever that be, but it stands for contributing to the common good and for the living together for. Yeah. Sorry for a bit lengthier response, but that's what you triggered in me as speaking about it. Thank you. Shall I stay here for the questions, or how would you?
I'm sure there probably are a couple of questions. I don't want us to take it too long, though. Are there questions?
Or comments?
Does anyone have questions? Well, maybe not. I do want to
Natalia, I
say,
think, was... yeah.
oh, come on, Natalia.
Hello. Yes, great. Good to see you again, and wonderful, wonderful lecture. I have a question stemming from the theological subset of your lecture, the fourth, I believe. You were talking about the Lutheran doctrine of the two kingdoms and the way in which it has been appropriated by the Lutheran Church, or perhaps more broadly in Brazil, through a Barthian lens, which brings more gravitas to the kingdom of God, the lordship of God, as opposed to the earthly kingdom. And I wonder, given the predominance of the Catholic Church in Brazil, and the history that might continue today of what Gustavo Gutierrez, neighboring on the west, and may God bless his soul, he just died a day ago, speaks about, so Gutierrez speaks about a kind of a different mix that has been historically present in Latin America. He calls it the Christendom model, and he differentiates between different varieties of the Christendom model. Now, in the Christendom model, there is a kind of a reciprocal, bivalent relation between the church and the state, with the two supporting each other. And I wonder if what's your take on the way in which the Protestant Christians, and particularly Lutheran Christians, have a way to push against that on theological grounds, on public theological grounds, by speaking more emphatically about the two kingdoms, rather than bringing them together in Barthian way. That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first about, it's important to remember that the Catholic Church stood for many of the things, and still stands, of this moralistic agenda I spoke about at the end, which also many Protestant or evangelical, as they're called now in the broad sense, churches stand for. So there are even alliances today, in fact, which are not so much spoken about, but they are real. And of course, the Catholic Church was dominant even on state politics and so on for a very long time. Now, ironically or not, when religious freedom and the end of the patronage system and of the state church in 1889-90 came, the Catholic Church was freed of state control and became much more active and present in the congregation than it had ever been before. So in 1900 you have 20 dioceses. Today we have about 300. And in the early 30s especially, the Catholic Action from the Italian model, then later came the Belgian model, which is quite different, but the Italian model, which also had a lot of proximity to integralism and to a certain type of fascism even. This was sort of what installed itself also as an idea of the new Christendom, precisely, in Brazil. And the symbol of that, the visible symbol, is Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro. Yeah? Because when it was opened with the Cardinal of Rio de Janeiro, Dom Sebastião Leme, and many other bishops and archbishops and so on, and the leader of the provisional government, Getúlio Vargas, who was an agnostic, but he went, of course, to the event, and then the Cardinal Leme said, either the government respects the faith of the people, or the people will not respect the government. And that was a very clear message. And then the Catholic Church became stronger than ever before. Yeah? Now, then, of course, other tendencies came up in the 1950s when the Italian Catholic Action came more to the fore with young people and farmers and industrial workers and so on, articulating for a more revolutionary take and social take on the issues. And then when the military government started to also sack some priests and even bishops from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, even moderate bishops or conservative bishops, turned over against the government. And some evangelical churches stepped in the void, in the vacuum that was created from in some areas, and used it for their own ends. Not the Lutheran Church, but so you have that, and of course still today, when there is the anniversary of Rio de Janeiro, the bishop will be next to the mayor. Yeah. So this is still visible, although today Rio de Janeiro is one of the most religiously plural cities in Brazil. But it's slowly changing that they have at least a multiple church leaders next to them, or even only others in some of the places. This is slowly changing. So apparently the place that was conquered by the Catholic leaders at that time is exchangeable for other religious leaders. And it depends on whatever the more interesting working together is. So in that context, the two kingdoms, or two regiments, I would rather say, doctrine, because in fact it has two parts. No? The two kingdoms from Augustine is a different idea. And it doesn't speak about how to organize state and church. No, it's the Christian who is both in the Civitas Dei, but also in the Civitas Terrena. That's where he lives, is being the Christian. And he wanted, of course, to excuse the Christians from having had anything to do with the destruction of Rome. That was sort of what put him on writing that book in the first place. But the two regiments, or regimes, as Vitor Westele translates it, that, yes, has a bearing on how the relationship is to be constructed. And there, of course, Luther, especially in his writing to the nobility, the German nobility, would say, you are not submissive to the Pope. You're on your own, and you have your own vocation, and you're directly linked to God. You're also part of the universal priesthood. No? Now, he ended up throughout his life giving a lot, maybe too much power to the local princes. No? So that was also problematic to some extent. Of course, you have the consequences that had for the peasants' revolt and for the Jews and so on. So it's not just an easy history we have there, but it sort of strengthened that part. But the idea of being two that are under God, in that view, both are. Yeah? But they have different tasks. This, I think, is an interesting model also for today, to say, of course, I would have difficulty to say they are both under God, because as a Christian maybe I can see it like that, but that's not a principle we can use in the public sphere. No? They would rather go with Habermas and saying, no, in the first place we have to translate our convictions into something that is publicly acceptable and which can enter public discourse and then give a solution for which works for all. But to say that these are not separate in the sense of Eigengesetzlichkeit as it was in the Nazi time. They would say, well, that means the church is one thing and the state is another. And just the brackets here, interesting as I've dug a bit into the history of the Barmer Declaration for the 90 years, to see that the majority of those who voted for the Barmer Declaration were members of the Nazi Party. And majoritatively Protestants had voted for Hitler. Now, that wasn't in my view when I learned first about the Barmer Declaration as a student and so on. I was fascinated by it. But then you see, it was actually not quite as heroic, and it's not a coincidence that there's no thesis about the Jews in the Barmer Declaration. Of course, Bonhoeffer, as you quoted, would speak about it, and Barth and so on, but it's not in the Declaration, and it wouldn't have been adopted had it been there, because many of those had the same anti-Semitic ideas that the general population held at the time. Now, some changed later, but at that moment, that was it. So just the brackets on Barmen also did not solve completely the problem, because people were sometimes, they just said the church cannot introduce the Aryan paragraph and whatever the state asked her to do, because it has its own government. But that is not, I think, as Luther meant it, and it's not what I find interesting. But it's exactly it's a separation. So the church should not do the state's job, and the state should not do the church's job. That can, I think, be continued as a principle. But for the church, it means to have a critical and constructive position. And today, maybe more than ever, we need a constructive access to democracy, which we might not have. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all that you have given us. And I must say, Rudolf, you brought us more than one gift. Your message was a gift to us. It is the kind of rich academic rigor that I'm hoping we will continue to bring. But you have certainly set the bar high, and we thank you for that. And I want to call you up, Rob, because the other gift that he brought is to the library, a copy of his book. And so I give that to you. It's been signed by the author.
Wonderful.
And so that our students will be enriched even more by his presence. Katie, I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough for answering the call. I love you dearly, and I'm so thankful that you came today. We have a very small, but I'm sure appetizing reception planned for you. Please join us next door. And to the degree that you have questions you didn't ask, hopefully our author will be around, or our speaker will be around for a little while to be able to engage you. Have a wonderful evening, and again, thank you for coming.